Okay, we're back for what I hope is our third and final video to finish up these last couple of slides. So we're going to look at some historical interpretations that talk about systemic weaknesses that might have been very difficult for the Kuomintang to solve or address, even if Japan had never set upon a course to invade China and completely disrupt the balance of power between the Kuomintang and groups like the Chinese Communist Party, or perhaps a lot of people place a heavy emphasis on the idea that Japan's invasion and the response of the Kuomintang completely expended the populace's support and enthusiasm for Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek and his regime. For one, the gains made with Western powers didn't seem to matter a lot to a public that was frustrated with the Kuomintang's policy of appeasement toward Japan. That, in essence, is what undermined the movement of Confucian fascism, the New Life movement, and the formation of these groups. There just never seemed to be much among many of the people that had initially put the Kuomintang in power and helped build the government in Nanjing to win them over to this idea that the greater enemy to the Chinese people was peasants, union workers, and radicals like Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, versus the idea that this encroaching Japanese imperial army that didn't seem to be held back was less of a threat than those groups. But even outside of those conditions, there were systemic weaknesses, at least according to historian John King Fairmay, that made the Nanjing government likely to falter like past regimes. The first was that once in power, it favored conformity in thought over public debates and used party police to attack radicals, but also people that just moderately criticized or questioned the regime. This included engineers, newspaper editors, and university professors, and the press was actually much more heavily censored now than it was in the warlord era. Colleges were forced to consent to governmental regulation and oversight, and intellectual freedom on college campuses and schools was reduced in the mid-1930s in favor of political indoctrination. Curriculum promoting Sun Yat-sen's three principles of the people was installed. In short, the Nanjing government inherited China's ruling class tradition with its glaring weaknesses. It couched political authority and molar leadership in Confucianism, but it could no longer count on the loyalty of the people or even educated elites. And it was also prone to many of their other weaknesses that were systemic. It struggled with taxation, it struggled with internal factionism, it struggled with rural violence and rebellion and a lack of order at the social level within many rural villages and regions of China living on the periphery, and it struggled from its inability to check the aggression of foreign powers. One of the more surprising weaknesses, though, was its conservative outlook was that the government of Chiang Kai-shek had kind of a parasitic relationship with business and trade. Trade taxes were high, which stifled the domestic industrial sector and discouraged foreign investment. A lot of the leading capitalists, bankers, and merchants, not named Song in this era, were often bullied or coerced into giving loans and funding to the Kuomintang to fuel its campaigns like the Northern Expedition to put it in power, and then thereafter to continue its maintenance of power. So it just continued to sap those areas of industry and its supporters, eventually alienating them. Especially in the 1930s, Kuomintang officials became more corrupt, looking upon high office as a right to profit from government. And this too was kind of an outlook that had been entrenched within elites in the late Qing era. Development schemes, monopolies, personal agencies, these were all used by politicians to dominate industry and finance. So it was parasitic in that they taxed them and they bullied them into giving funding over to the state, but then they also used governmental power to make business and industry the privy of those in power, which stifled a lot of innovation and development. The result was personal gain for party members, but the national government was not actually able to achieve fiscal solvency. It was a glaring economic weakness, and the political cost was just as great. Counter to the rhetoric of the Chinese Communist Party, the Kuomintang didn't actually represent the interest of the middle classes in power. Instead, it exploited them. Second, in terms of crisis, the Kuomintang relied too heavily on a lot of its power within cities. Then this involves the most contentious argument about the Kuomintang, and that is that it virtually neglected or ignored the countryside. In the 1930s, the conditions of the vast majority of Chinese who still labored in rural areas, often by hand on small plots of land, was the most pressing intellectual issue of the day. There had been little improvement in the lives of rural Chinese since the Qing, not in income, nor in machinery, education, health, or material convenience. Studies by Chinese and also international scholars showed most were being devastated by a vicious cycle of soil exhaustion, deforestation, and erosion. And this was compounded by exploitive tenancy arrangements and the collapse of prices internationally for soybeans, silk, cotton, and tobacco, especially in the 1930s after the Worldwide Depression. So historians take the Kuomintang to task for not intervening, instead choosing to allow provincial governments, landlords, and remaining warlords considerable autonomy at the local and provincial level. And left to their own devices, these local elites bullied rural masses, and eventually allowed a groundswell of support to form around the Chinese Communist Party as they pitched its bid to power on the promise of land reform. Now, there were private attempts to solve the agrarian crisis that were attempted, and James Yen, a Sichuanese intellectual, educated in the U.S., who later worked in France for the YMCA during the First World War, pioneered these efforts. Pictured here on this book by Charles Way Hayford, we see his efforts that became kind of a model for future developments that were actually expanded upon by the Chinese Communist Party. Yen actually returned to China in the 1920s, and he designed a number of experimental villages in Ding County of North China to teach its inhabitants basic literacy, hygiene, and introduce new technologies and a degree of self-governance. Part of a broader movement at the rural level known as mass education, Yen's villages were partly Confucian, partly Christian in ideology, and funded by American philanthropic organizations such as the Rockefeller Foundation. Similar projects were launched by Chinese intellectuals in other areas, but the fact that these were private in nature and that sometimes they were rejected or stymied by the state because they lent heavily on foreign influences meant their impact was minimized to a given area. Conversely, their goals, such as improving agricultural productivity through science and machinery, raising the standard of living and education in the countryside, and encouraging political participation through study and also art, became the very same goals that were eventually taken up by the communists in the 1940s and 1950s. This lack of governmental authority in the countryside represented a second dimension of the Nanjing government's weakness, and that was that their scale of government was too small. The nation was too vast and diverse, and yet the tax base at Nanjing Canton was too small to finance modern agronomy, roads, industrial plants, and a well-equipped military all at once. The real error of the Kuomintang came with its inability to grasp at how its hold on power alienated key constituents. And this is where I want you to focus on the readings from Spence that talk about the survival of the communist movement in the Long March and their massive growth in numbers during the Second World War. Too often the Kuomintang conscripted food, conscripted labor, men, and material for its forces. It demoralized the peasantry and the commoners of rural China that the Kuomintang and its armies encountered during those periods by forcing undue hardship on them, by exploiting them, while in return the CCP offered to take land from a privileged and powerful minority in the countryside to the benefit of the majority. And this is kind of the key difference between the two parties in the 1930s and 1940s. Okay, I want to be sure to try and wrap this up before we have to have a fourth video, which is just too many YouTube videos of me meandering. for you to digest this week. So in conclusion, many of the weaknesses sound like history repeating. The same problems with revenue, a wanting of moral authority, political legitimacy at the center, and a plague of administrative evils like corruption and profiting from power sound eerily similar to the diseases that ended the Ming and Qing dynasty. That might be when so many argue that Zheng's regime failed on the mainland because when faced with a crisis of unity, the Kuomintang fell back on the old imperial model. It turned to Confucian fascism as a way to restore the old, rather than explore new means of organizing and creating a modern society. Whether or not the Kuomintang was capable of addressing or surviving these flaws is irrelevant, though. The Japanese invasion destroyed much of the Nanjing government. It eradicated its early successes and destroyed its base of power in the lower Yangtze region. It took hold of Nanjing and Shanghai, the areas where the regime was most stable, most prosperous, most powerful, and had its strongest footing in its relationship through trade and diplomacy with Western powers. It is also worth noting that from Imperial Japan's vantage point, the strength and success of the Kuomintang regime is in part what inspired its desperation to turn to attack, to absorb and consolidate it. Militarists and imperial planners in Japan worried that the window for asserting supremacy over China was closing, and they were forced into action. All the systemic weaknesses, whether they would have spelled an inevitable rise of the CCP and Mao, matter far less than the basic fact that the Kuomintang's project of building a strong modern state was cut short by the invasion of Japan. Manchuria and its neighboring areas in 1931 were conquered, and this put the Kuomintang on the defensive against an encroaching army, but also with its own people, who soured on Zhang Jie's philosophy of appeasement and internal unity and solidification of its base of power. It was a military man solution rooted in a traditional outlook. China had lost territory and could trade space for time to strengthen its core, but that failed to account for the fires of nationalism that burned so hot among youth, intellectuals, but now increasingly among peasants and factory workers. Chinese from all walks of life by the 1930s had a very low boiling point for haughty foreign powers, especially one as given to cruelty, fraud, and terror as the Japanese Imperial Army. It makes sense then to mark the end of the Nationalist decade, a period that may have seen China choose a path to modernity that did not lead to Mao and communism, as coming to a close in Nanjing in 1937. Overrunning Chinese forces in Beijing, then Shanghai, the Nationalist Army and Zhang abandoned their capital that year to carry on the war from Wuhan, and later Chongqing, far in the west, while the residents of Nanjing were subject to a massacre, indiscriminate slaughter, rape, and mutilation that defined the Chinese experience of war for the next 8 years. We're going to talk a little bit more about the communist survival of Zhang Jie's betrayal and this split within the ranks of the Northern Expedition and the beginnings of the Second World War in our next lecture video that'll be posted on Thursday. Let me know if you have questions. Thanks so much for listening, and good luck with the readings. Also, be safe and be well out there. I hope you are someplace with lots of good fun despite the boredom of being socially distant and isolated. All's well.